This week, a Georgia superintendent stands strong against inappropriate material in his school libraries. The crowd turns on a trans athlete dominating an Oregon track and field event. And a panel discussion on the role of pastors, churches, and citizens in educating kids and the culture at large. These stories and much more coming up this week on The Lion Week in Review. Welcome into this week's edition of The Lion Week in Review. It's a weekly look at the culture, the courts, your state capitol, and your kids. I'm Chris Stegall. Now, let's meet our panel, some of the men and women behind the stories at readlion.com. Josh Mann is the managing editor. Michael Ryan, our executive editor, and Jillian Schneider is a staff writer at The Lion. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thanks.
You bet. Some good news to kick off the week. I like when we start on a positive note. A superintendent actually standing up for kids, Josh Mann.
Yes, Chris Ragsdale's a superintendent in Georgia at Cobb County Schools, and during a school board meeting, he gave a speech of sorts, kind of a monologue, and he just basically gave all the reasons why he removed some books that he considered vulgar, explicit, lewd, etc. from the school, and he stood firmly by his decision and said he has a legal obligation to protect the children at the school. He's got a custodial responsibility, and so do the educators. And he said any educator who doesn't believe so shouldn't be in the classroom. And multiple times during the monologue, he had the applause erupted in affirmation of what he was saying. And reportedly, he's been under some criticism by some left-wing groups who think that he shouldn't be making some of these decisions. But he said, you know what, that's my job. If you don't like it, then too bad.
So strange, but here we are. You make a speech like Harrison Butker did. We talked about that in the last show, or you just stand up for kids and keep smut out of school libraries, and now you're the villain. I mean, of course people are applauding, Michael, because it's sane.
It is. It's a revolution in insanity, and which means he's probably being investigated by the DOJ now. But, you know, in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Well, this is the truth. Proffering porn to kids is a crime outside of the class. And why wouldn't it be a crime inside? In Georgia law, it shall be unlawful for any person knowingly to furnish or disseminate to a minor any picture, photograph, drawing, sculpture, motion picture, or similar visual representation or image of a person or portion of the human body which depicts sexually explicit nudity, sexual conduct, or sadomasochistic abuse, and which is harmful to minors, or any book, pamphlet, magazine, printed matter, however reproduced, or sound recording which contains any such matter or explicit and detailed verbal descriptions or narrative accounts of sexual excitement, sexual conduct, or sadomasochistic abuse, and which taken as a whole is harmful to minors. For this super, a red line was crossed, and this is a hill to die on.
Jillian, this doesn't seem hard, does it? Is this the way it'll have to go? Somebody takes the lead like this superintendent and this becomes the norm?
Yeah, I think absolutely that the push to get these sorts of books made available to kids has been happening really slowly, and for a long time it's kind of been a slippery slope. And it's going to take people just standing up and saying, no, this is wrong and we can't do this. And like Michael was saying, this isn't just illegal. It's not just the law that's saying this is wrong. We know scientifically that pornography and these sorts of materials do damage to children's brains. It rewires the way you think. We know from a sociological standpoint that children who are exposed to this tend to have problems later in life. It causes relational issues. It causes mental health issues. And so there's really no excuse, given what we already know about pornography and these sorts of materials, to not be standing up against this. It's just inexcusable.
I was just reading today in the New York Post a story about virtual reality pornography. Yikes. I mean, it's the levels that this is going, the degradation, the cultural rot, and people that are going to have to stand in the breach. Boy, it's a time for choosing for sure. Jillian, while we have you, the next story at readline.com, it's yet another story of a biological male competing against biological women and dominating. Not a surprise, out in Oregon again.
Yeah, there was the case of a high school student, a young man who competed in track and field against the young woman. And rather like the superintendent's story, this individual was actually booed when they received their medal. The crowd cheered and applause for all of the young women who competed and received medals, but when it came to giving the first place medal to a young man, the Oregon crowd wasn't having it, and they booed his supposed victory. And I think it just goes to show you that media outlets or commentators on the left have kind of tried to gaslight people who call this problem and said, oh, it's not really happening. It's so few cases. Oh, they're cherry picking and all these sorts of arguments. But I mean, that's clearly not the case. It's happening everywhere. It's happening to everyday girls who are just trying to run track and field in high school. And the fact that the liberal media is still trying to sweep this under the rug is to me baffling.
It's interesting, Josh. She said it's very similar to the superintendent's story. I agree. Is it just a matter of continued obstinance to this kind of aggressive left-wing push? Is it just going to take people just standing up and saying, nope, just no, that's it?
I think so. I wonder if the tide is going to turn or if it's starting to turn. But what struck me when I watched the video was during the race, I can't remember if it was a 200-meter. It wasn't a long race, and you can see the runners coming around, and the transgender, the biological male runner was in neck and neck with a woman, with a girl, with a biological female, and you could almost hear and feel the crowd cheering. They were cheering for the runners, presumably for the female, because as soon as the biological male started to come ahead one stride and then a second stride right before the finish, the boos start. And it was almost as if you could just tell a majority in this crowd felt like something unfair had just happened.
Yes.
And to me, I was just almost a visceral moment of, collectively, I think people are saying, look, this isn't fair. Whatever you think about that male's decision to change genders, there's something unfair that just happened to these girls.
And Michael, we'll get into a story you've written, or an editorial you've written here shortly, that I think is kind of a cousin to this. So I'll leave off with this and then pivot to that in a moment, which is this notion that if you are unhappy at this kind of disparity and unfairness in competition, that you're being cruel. I hear that a lot, that, that's just cruel, that's bigoted, that's hateful. It's not, but it is an anger at a fundamental unfairness, and there is a difference.
Yeah, and I think that kind of reaction is taking sides. Well, it's clear what side this crowd took. And I think that booing feels like a watershed moment in this debate. It seems as if the boys participating in girls' sports have lost the crowd. And a Gallup poll last year shows that they are losing the crowd. It said 69% believe that you ought to stay in the sport according to your gender at birth. And that was up from a previous year by 7%. 69% went from 62 to 67. So it looks like they are losing the crowd.
We have seen a new denominational split recently. Another Protestant denomination, the Methodist faith, has split over LGBTQ issues. They're not the first. They're certainly not going to be the last, but we continue to see this. Most recently, Nora O'Donnell tried to press the Pope on this. I think most faiths are having battles within about these cultural moments. And Michael, you've written a piece to that point about those in the pulpit and their role in these battles culturally.
Yeah. Well, I was privileged to interview Bob Vanderplatz with the family leader out of Iowa. And they exist to help the church get more active in civic life, which they're not precluded from doing. And that includes, by nature, voting, and certainly voting your values. And he made the point to me that 37% of church-going Christians who are registered to vote aren't voting. That's a problem. And this whole separation of church and state, which has cowed pastors and church-going Christians from really voicing their values in the public square, it's a bit of a canard. You don't have to check your faith at the government's door. There's just no reason that you have to do that. In fact, Bob would say that there is a biblical obligation not to do that and to inform the government of your values. I asked Bob what role he thinks that faith is going to play in saving America from its current decline and degradation. He said, frankly, it's our only hope.
Jillian, I know in my own personal church, we have 2 school board members in my community who ran and won their seats. Another one who's currently seeking a seat. That would be 3 members of my church in our public school board. I don't know how common that is in the community, but I'll just say anecdotally, my church finds it important that our members get involved in civic life. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's super important for everybody to be involved in civic life. And this story reminded me of something funny that happened a month or 2 ago, which was that Richard Dawkins, the incredibly famous atheist who's probably done more for atheism than anybody else has in the past 100 years, came out and said, I'm not a Christian, but I would hate to not live in a Christian culture. I want the trappings of Christianity. I want the Christmas songs. I want the hymns. I want the big churches, but I just don't want to have to actually believe in any of the God stuff. And it was so funny to me because it goes to show you that when you take out the core of Christian beliefs, what Christianity actually says, what Christian values are, you're going to lose all of the external stuff too, and it's going to leave a void, and that void is going to be filled by something. And so as Christians, I don't think we can take the separation of church and state to mean that we shouldn't bring faith into politics, because the reality is if we take faith out of social life, out of political life, then it's going to be filled by some other worldview, some other version of faith that is not going to be as good for our country and as good for the next generation. And so, we have to run for school board, run for city council, volunteer. We have to, at the very least vote. And I think that when Michael's message is exactly right, that's our hope for America, is that we have to be communicating our values and sharing our values as a society.
Yes, and Josh, we talk often here at the foundation, the Herzog Foundation, obviously, about school choice issues, Christian school, people homeschooling, churches getting involved. And, in my time here and covering various stories and talking with different faith leaders, there's still a lot of people that are kind of loath to get into the school choice debate or even open their churches to create schools. I don't think, and I'll just speak for myself when I say, I don't know that church leaders, if they're serious about this, can afford to sit on the sidelines.
Yeah, I think, I was so impressed with this group. What they are not is they're not an issues-driven organization that wants to rope churches in to
This
help
is the family leader in Iowa, I should mention, by the way, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And they're not just trying to rope churches in to get something across the legislative finish line. It's the other way around. They want Christians to engage in their faith in biblical ways, to engage in civic life, and not be afraid, not be cowed and not be afraid to do this. And so I think it is important that pastors consider, I think, because right now, with social media the way it is, if you stick your neck out on an issue, you might get your head chopped off.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of fear about that. But, when it comes to biblical values, pastors have an obligation to stand by those and to, frankly, help their congregations be critical thinkers and to think through, what are my obligations? I think right now the left also wants to scare churches into avoiding certain issues, and they'll hold nonprofit status over their heads and other kinds of things. But, the First Amendment is important for a reason, and I think churches can probably do a little bit more to engage.
I'm going to put you guys on the spot a little bit here. There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious your thoughts. Now that we've had a week and some change of the Harrison-Butker kerfuffle, I'd like to go around the horn and ask, do you think after Harrison Butker gives a speech like that and the ensuing coverage that has just swamped national and international news, is he in a better position or in a worse position today? Do you think Harrison Butker benefited ultimately from this or took a lot of slings and arrows to his detriment? Professionally, I guess, just in his own. And I just ask that for frame of reference. As Josh said, people are nervous to stick their necks out. Harrison Butker certainly did. Has he paid a price for it, or would you say it's elevated him to a more meaningful level, Michael?
Yes.
Yes.
It's both. He's been elevated and he's taking brickbats. But I think that's a good thing. I think you need to have people out there taking the arrows and telling the truth. It's a revolutionary act.
Jillian?
I completely agree with Michael. I subscribe to the philosophy of all press is good press, and I think the fact that Harrison Butker is getting his name and his message out there, even if some of that is through negative coverage, can only ultimately do good.
It is interesting that, I mean, you know, we talk about, you saw that awful video of Sean Combs, P. Diddy, everyone you want to call him, just beating a woman savagely. And the outrage of the week was how Harrison Butker spoke of mothers. And I mean, it's just strange. I think my point in asking this question, Josh Mann, is the moral outrage almost seems feigned and silly when you have a story like that side by side at the exact same time.
Yeah, it does. And I think how many kickers have started a national conversation? I mean,
Right.
really, ever. You know, the kicker famously has one of the hardest jobs because you only have one job, and if you get it wrong just a little bit, you're going to be thrown under the bus. But he was brave, courageous. I don't think he I don't think he'll be any more shy about it, having taken the arrows. And I think it is important. I think, you know, unfortunately, a lot of people probably aren't listening to the full speech. They don't understand all the things that he said. But even if you don't fully agree, listen to it and think about, there's a whole lot of mothers who even have successful careers outside of the home who are saying, yeah, we stand with Harrison, and kudos to him for praising his wife. And one other thought I've had on this week, I've happened to see two different people. Denzel Washington praise his wife at an award show. This is sometime in the last 10 or 15 years. You know, you get fed these social media videos. And I thought, you know what, Denzel and Butker, they kind of said the same thing. And I love Denzel. We all love Denzel. And then you know who else I saw praise his wife in a 2012 speech? Joe Biden praised Jill Biden for her support. And I thought, these messages are all very similar. And I think probably there's more agreement out there than maybe the media is suggesting.
As you say it, it makes me think of the Will Smith famously slapping Chris Rock for speaking ill of his wife, Jada Pinkett Smith. Now, I don't think most people agreed with Will Smith slapping Chris Rock, but there were people at the time who said, now there's a man standing up for his lady. Michael, remember that?
I do. I do. And, you know, the NFL is famously not standing behind Harrison Butker.
Yeah.
But they're foursquare behind his jersey sales because a lot of women snatched up jerseys.
Sold out of women's jerseys, as a matter of fact.
Yep,
Isn't that
sold
something? Jillian, we turn now. We've talked a lot about the Christian faith here. Interesting, you've written about Jewish private school enrollment shooting through the roof.
Yeah, so this article really came from a question of mine, which was whether the October 7th terrorist attacks and the subsequent war between Israel and Hamas had affected how Jewish parents are thinking about educating their kids in America. And the answer is yes. Since those attacks, there have been a few pretty small surveys done. Obviously, it's kind of hard to study something while it's happening. But the studies have shown that Jewish schools are getting more interest from parents, that parents are switching from public education or even private education, private secular education, because they want to send their kid to a Jewish school or to a yeshiva, which is a type of Jewish school, and they're rediscovering how important that is to them and understanding that education isn't just about the ABCs or the 1, 2, 3s, that for them education is about imparting their values, their religion, their tradition, their worldview, their way of life. And there was a quote from one father who lives in the San Francisco, the Bay Area, and I want to read what he said because I think it's really important. He said, "We didn't always appreciate how important it was to send our children to Jewish schools as we thought we could supplement their Judaism at home. But looking back, I asked myself how I missed this. How did I not see how important this was earlier?" And I think a lot of Christian parents or even just parents who maybe don't have a particular faith but see the public schools teaching something that isn't aligned with their values, we all need to realize this, that if you're sending your kids somewhere for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months out of the year, they're going to be learning somebody's values. They're going to be learning somebody's worldview. And if that worldview doesn't align with yours, maybe you should think about sending your kid to a different sort of school.
You know, one wonders if while we talk a lot about Christian education in particular, it is interesting what Jillian said about Jewish schools. And we have seen in the recent year or months, I guess, in this past year or so, a lot of Muslim parents standing up at public school board meetings saying very similar things. They don't like the curriculum, the LGBTQ, the transgender stuff. Is this maybe a rare unifying moment, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, Michael, culturally?
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah.
And maybe even Dawkins' kids.
Yeah.
I can't recommend Christopher Rufo's book of last year, America's Cultural Revolution, enough. It explains exactly how we got to where we are in terms of how the left basically took over almost every cultural institution that we have. I'd like to build on what Jillian said. One parent in our story said, "We felt that the school had been moving away from our values for some time." I think that's a tremendously profound comment, and it captures this moment in history perfectly. It used to be that in looking for a school, we would look at convenience. It's at the neighborhood school. We would look at proximity. We would look at the teachers, maybe the administrators. Now we need to look first at the values that they promote.
Josh, man, the stories that you continue to write at The Lion on the gender transition stuff, it is so interesting to me that Europe sort of led the pack on the initial dive into gender surgeries and medical chemical castration for kids. And now, after about a decade of monkeying around with it, it seems they're all shouting, stop, we're not doing this, in many cases outlawing it for minors. You continue to write about this, that it seems European doctors are saying to us here in the United States, knock it off, you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, and this British pediatrician, Dr. Hilary Cass, who we've been reporting on, she was kind of the lead author on a report in Britain. It was basically a review of how they're treating minors with gender dysphoria. And she came out and said, look, we don't have any long-term evidence of what we're doing to these kids. We need to stop. And they're stopping. NHS England is going to stop. They're rewriting even their constitution to affirm biological sex, and they're making a whole host of changes. Well, the New York Times interviewed this doctor, and one of the things that she said, that her view of the United States medical organizations who continue to support what we're doing, this push towards surgical intervention for minors and other kinds of interventions, she said they're out of date. Frankly, they're out of date. And so, again, it's just one more reminder that, as you say, while Europe has its foot on the brakes on this issue, we continue to have our foot on the gas pedal. And it's time that I think the administration and these medical organizations lay aside their political ideologies and they really look at the evidence, because we are irreversibly harming children. And, you know, what other area of civic life do we tolerate that? I can't think of one.
Jillian, that was the point that Josh just raised was a question I wanted to volley to you, which was, what drives our medical community then to just seemingly willfully ignore Europe's warning? Is it profit-driven? Is it politics? Is it both, or something else?
I mean, there's certainly a lot of profit in it. I don't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but I know that these gender surgeries can be, thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars. And on
I've
top
heard
of
it's
that,
already, and sorry to interrupt, I've heard it's already a multi-billion-dollar industry in children's medicine.
Oh, it is. Yeah, I don't know. An individual surgery can cost tens of thousands of dollars, and let alone all of the chemical or the hormone treatments that go along with that. And often the medical establishment isn't just a one-time patient. They're not just coming in, having this surgery, and then going home and never going back to the doctor. When a person does this to themselves, they become essentially a patient for life. I've heard some people from that community who detransition describe it as a medical leash. Once they go into this world, they never get back out. They're always going to be needing medical care because of what they've done to their body, and it's horrifying. It's tragic that they have to experience that. Even if they try to go back to their original gender, they're still going to suffer lifelong effects from that. And so I don't want to assume that every doctor, or every nurse, every practitioner does this purely for the profit. I think some do it because they think that it's the right thing to do, and they think they're helping, and they just don't understand really the cost of this. But I certainly think that the underbelly of this is an incredibly profitable medical industry that is it's the free market, and if people want to pay for it, then that's the system we live in. People can make money off of it.
Michael Ryan, our final piece today is an opinion piece that I think seems obvious to many, but maybe not. I guess it's kind of controversial to some, and that is the just general idea that public education is really not a thing, that there really is no public responsibility to educate your child or anyone else's.
Yeah. Well, that was written by our great freelancer, Sean Z. And, it does bring up the question, why, with the test scores the way they are, the racial, sexual indoctrination in the schools, and everything else that's going on in public schools, the violence and everything, why teachers' unions are so hell-bent on preventing options for parents and kids. In Michigan, they actually moved to ban charter schools from moving into old abandoned public schools. I mean, they'd rather have a barren field than a charter school. And yet, education is the most important thing we'll ever do as a society. But it's the one institution in our society that is so hidebound and so tied to the past. Occasionally, they talked in the story about the fact that the K through 12 education system has been nearly immune from claims of malpractice. That's largely true. Now, occasionally, somebody will sue a state for not living up to the promises in its constitution to educate kids the way they should be, but that only results in more money going to the same approach. Heaven forbid that we try something new.
Josh, is there a public responsibility to educate your children or mine? I guess that's sort of an interesting, fundamental 30,000-foot question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's one ultimately as a society we have to decide. And there are some state constitutions that speak to that. And so it differs from state to state. I think biblically and as a person of faith, Christian faith, the parents have the ultimate responsibility. That sounds, pretty familiar. There's a lot of people that agree with that, even from maybe not biblical background. But God certainly gives parents that responsibility. But I think also, personally, I think public education is important. It's important that we use funds to educate children. Now, I think parents should have choices in how those funds are used. But what I thought was the profound point made in the article was really raising the question, what recourse do parents have when educators fail? If your doctor screws up your surgery, you have legal recourse. If your child is screwed up because of a poor education, there's really no legal recourse. There's hardly any. And so I thought, that's a fair point. And yet, what the educational establishment is asking for, well, it's just more money. We need more money. We're underfunded. And now, what doctor who is performing badly would you just buy that argument from?
Well, I'm old enough to remember there was a fad, I think it was in the 90s, where high schools would offer warranties that these graduates are guaranteed to be fit to leave high school. They dropped that like a brick, didn't they?
Jillian, you're about to be a mother. Is there a public responsibility to teach your child, or you to teach or see to it your neighbor's child is taught properly?
I mean, I agree with Josh. I think certainly from the Christian perspective, parents have a responsibility to their children, family members, community members, church members. We do live in an interconnected society, and I think we have a responsibility just to be the good Samaritan and to the people around us. But Michael's point is absolutely right. When it comes to the state constitution and our governmental system, the government doesn't have an obligation to guarantee that your child is educated. Very honestly, because that's an unreasonable burden to put on the government. At the end of the day, education happens so much in the home. Even if you send your kid to public school, parents still need to make sure that their kids are doing their homework, that they're, being read to at home, all of those sorts of things. So it would be, I think, unfair to make it the state's sole responsibility to guarantee that your child is educated, because I don't think that's reasonable. But the flip side of that is that the government's only responsibility is to provide a system in which the child can be educated. And that's very different than actually educating the child. State constitutions usually say something along the lines of there has to be a free public education system. And sometimes they'll sneak the word quality in there, but it's rarely defined what a quality public education system is.
Well, before we wrap up this week's show, as we like to do every week, we go around the horn and ask our panel their favorite stories at readlion.com. So, Michael Ryan, what do you like this week?
Well, we have a story just up. Headline is Gender-Affirming Surgery Linked to 12-Fold Increase in Suicide Risk, which I think is remarkable because purveyors, obviously, of sex changes in minors claim it's the opposite.
Josh Mann?
We've got a story about a church that started a Christian school just after they'd suffered a fire in their building. They had a lot of obstacles that they had to overcome to get this school started, but they were successful, and so kind of a feel-good story you can find on The Lion.
Good stuff. And Jillian?
Now, my version of a feel-good story is just that I'm very excited to see 26 states now in total are opposing the Biden administration trying to rewrite Title IX. And it's an issue I've been covering for a while now, and it's encouraging to see the rubber hit the road and so many of our state and national leaders standing up to the Biden administration's insanity and just saying, no more, we're not going along with this. Men are men, women are women, get over it.
Great news coverage, smart editorials, passionate work by some real pros at readlion.com. I hope people will check them all out. Panel, thank you for another great week. And that will do it for us this week. Be sure to keep up to date on all the latest news every single day at readlion.com. For all of us here at The Lion, thanks for downloading the show, and we'll see you next time.